Person of Interest. This is our third week, and what we get to watch for the next minute or so is what we call spoken word. And this is one of our students, actually, who put together some thoughts about what Pilate may have been thinking. So let's take a look.
As I wash my hands with water, it reeks of death. That which I perceived to be cleansing passivity now gnaws at my morals. Unsure how to stand up, I stood by. Why? Why had they insisted crucifixion they proclaimed on an innocent man? But to step forward would cause chaos. To step backwards would bring questions. And as these two heads of Janus bicker, I decide neither door would be proper. Though as the people shout, his blood is on us and our children, I am here drowning in my guilt. Slowly sinking, treading water in an endless ocean as the waves wash over me, the tides of blood, the blood of Jesus is on my hands, mine.
It was April 1st when Gail got the news from her boss. She would not be anchoring the news anymore. It was not so surprising. Anyone could have seen it coming. She was too spontaneous, refusing to read the anchor copy before they went live. She was too compassionate. She just couldn't remain detached from the stories that she was reporting on. The news for her was just the wrong job. But that's what Gail came to Baltimore to do. She had signed a long contract with WJZ, and frankly, she was too expensive to just let go. So the executives were convinced that they could find her a new role and get something out of their investment. So they sent her to New York City for a makeover, and even that was a failure. A bad reaction to one of the hair products, it seemed, and Gail came back to Baltimore almost completely bald. There were a few options left when the station told her to fill in on a morning show with little audience called People Are Talking. And people are still talking 40 years later about Gail as she skyrocketed to fame and fortune and became not only the first African American female to host a nationally syndicated talk show, but also the first African American female billionaire. Of course, Gail's full name is Oprah Gail Winfrey. Now, you might not have been aware of that story and all that led up to the Oprah that you're aware of today. And that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Doesn't matter. But it is a backdrop. It is an example of how we are in this series that Jim mentioned, Person of Interest, preparing for Easter. Each week, we're looking at a different person, a different life, a different name, a different story that you may not be so familiar with. And we're finding out how that life, that story, is inseparably linked to the story that everyone knows, the story of Easter. So that when we get to Easter Sunday, we will have a bigger picture of what it is that we are celebrating. So, if you're just joining us, let me catch you up in 30 seconds. Person of interest number one was Abraham, and we talked about thousands of years before Easter ever happened, God knew it was going to happen, planned for it to happen, because he promised that he would, in his faithfulness, make our relationship right. That our relationship with God was not based on our faithfulness, but on his. And he made this covenant promise to Abraham. So we found out that even when you doubt God, even when you doubt yourself, you can trust God because of his promise that he made to Abraham. And there's a little Abraham in all of us. Then last week, we looked at Herod, not Herod the Great, but his son Herod, who was there the day that Jesus was sentenced to be crucified. And we looked at these kingdoms that collided. That Jesus came proclaiming that there was a new kingdom that he was launching and that you could live in it if you wanted. And the problem was that there were already kingdoms in place. And the kings of those kingdoms don't take kindly to other kingdoms being formed. And so Jesus and Herod were on this collision course. And so, we learned that there's a little Herod in all of us. That we all have our little kingdoms where what we say goes. And that oftentimes our kingdom collides still into the kingdom that Jesus came to offer, came to invite us into. So we stuck our names up on crosses, a lot of us, to say, yeah, that's what led up to the cross. I'm a part of that. There's a little Herod in me. Now, today, as you just heard, the person of interest number 3 is Pilate. And perhaps he's the most famous of the ones that we've looked at so far, because he's actually the one who was involved in sentencing Jesus to die. Which is why it might surprise you when I say there's a little Pilate in all of us. You think, well, that's a little harsh, isn't it? Let me tell you what I mean. Pilate displays one of the most dangerous responses to Jesus. And I bet it's not what you think at first. Pilate responds primarily with apathy. Primarily for all of the influence that he had and all of the mock trial and all of the abuse and flogging that he ordered of Jesus. When it all boiled down to it, Pilate's response was basically, I don't think his life really has anything to do with my life. I just don't think that he matters all that much. And now here's my premise. I don't know about you, but my sense is that so many people in our day have that same response to Jesus. That they're not anti-Jesus, that they're not maybe even anti-God, but they just don't think it matters very much in their life. And I'm convinced that every week here and in Hampstead and online, we have people who are listening who just think that it doesn't matter all that much, that walking through the doors, they're not expecting anything to change because there's a little bit of Pilate in all of us. So I want to learn from him today. In fact, we're going to do a Q&A with Pilate. We're going to let him do the Q, and Jesus does most of the A. So Pilate, on the day that Jesus was sentenced to die, asked 3 very, very telling questions. And I want to show them to you. I want to read them together. And I want to look at the answers that were given to these 3 questions. So Q&A with Pilate today. Why? Because there's a little Pilate in all of us. Now, Q&A number 1 is found in Matthew chapter 27. So if you're going to follow along, you want to turn there now. Matthew's the first book of the New Testament. And chapter 27 and verse 11 through 14 is where I'll start. This is the first question that Pilate asks on the day that Jesus was crucified. Meanwhile, verse 11, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor, that would be Pilate, asked him, here comes question number 1, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony that they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Okay, so here we are. Press pause. We'll come back to this story. Question number 1 is repeated in all 4 Gospels. You might be aware of this, that all 4 of the Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all have a different perspective on the events of Jesus' life. And so they tell the story from a different angle. But every one of them records this question exactly the same way. It's incredibly important. And the question is this: are you the king of the Jews? That's what he asked to Jesus. And that's important for us to understand. The term king of the Jews was an actual title. It had been around for several generations. We know that Herod the Great had that title given to him by Rome. So the Roman authority got to decide who was king of the Jews. And it was a political appointment, someone who was to rule under Rome's authority in this section of the world. And so it's important for you to understand and for us to notice that what Pilate's asking here, question number one, is not religious. He's not saying, hey, are you the Messiah? He's not asking Jesus, are you the Son of God? Did you come to save the world? None of that is on his radar. What he asks when it boils down to it is, do you have a political agenda? Isn't that interesting? Well, of course, that's the life, that's the sphere in which he lives and operates. And so Pilate is saying, are you claiming that you have power? Are you saying that you are the one who's in control? Because politically, that's what it means, right? To say you have a political agenda means that you have power, and power politically is that you have authority. You're the one who's going to call the shots. And basically, Pilate is saying, is that what you're doing here, Jesus? And that's really important for us to understand, because that makes the answer so interesting. What's the answer? Jesus says this really sort of ambiguous, bizarre answer. Did you think of that when I read it? He says, you have said so. And you think, wait, is that a yes or a no? Exactly. Now, as soon as someone gives that answer, Jesus does here, we either fall to one side or the other in the way you interpret it. And even Bible interpreters take some liberties here, and some of them will say, yes, it is as you say. I think that's too positive. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. Some of them make it sound like Jesus is saying, well, that's what you say. I think that's too negative. Do you see the tension here? What did he say? Literally, he says these words, you say. That's it. That's what it literally says. Now, let me give you some context here, right? So you met Jim Powell this morning. Some of you know Jim. Some of you didn't know him before this morning. But Jim's been around here for 6 or 7 years. And so what if I came to Jim Powell this morning and I said, I'm so glad you're in Westminster. Jim, I have a question for you. And there's my question to Jim. Are you the best pastor at Crossroads? That's why I asked him. And Jim said, you say. What would he be saying? Right? See, if I interpreted that as Jim saying, well, that's what you say, then I'd be thinking, well, he doesn't think he is. But if I interpreted Jim as saying, well, I'm glad you finally figured it out, Reed. Yes, of course I am the best pastor at Crossroads. Well, that would be a whole different thing. Is it a yes or is it a no? And Jesus says, you say. And he doesn't say yes, and he doesn't say no. Why? See, I don't think it can be, you can interpret this as a mistake, as Jesus just was misquoted or something like that. It's too important. All 4 Gospels record the same thing. So why does he not say yes or no? Well, think about this. If he says yes, meaning, yes, I am a king that's here to overthrow the oppressive and corrupt government that is in place. That means that I am going to overthrow Rome, and I'm going to be the new ruler, and I'm the one that's going to call the shots. That would be misleading, because that is not Jesus' endgame. We know that. So he doesn't say yes, but he also doesn't say no. Because to say no would be to imply that he is just here, that I don't have any political aspirations. I'm just a spiritual guy. I'm just here to affect you personally, inwardly, spiritually. That's the only thing I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about the powers that be, the powers that are in control. I'm not concerned with that. That would be misleading, because clearly he is. So Jesus' answer is, you say. Yes and no. Is that frustrating to you? Imagine Pilate. He says, will you just pick one? Right? Pilate would love for him to be one or the other. There's a little Pilate in all of us. See, some of you would love for Jesus to be more political here. Some of you, let's be honest, it drives you crazy that Jesus lived with an extremely corrupt and corrosive and oppressive government in place, and it didn't seem to be the top thing on his agenda. You're thinking, how could that be? Like, we have a government, and it drives me crazy. And I think that we ought to, like that. You want Jesus to be, yes, I'm here to throw the bums out. That's not what he says. But you wish he would. Doesn't say that. And others of you, you would love for Jesus to say that he's not political. You think part of the problem is that Christians get too political and make Jesus political. And so you would love the scripture here for Jesus to say, no, Pilate, that is not what I'm here for. You're begging the text to say that he's only interested in spiritual things. But it won't say that. And Jesus won't let you do that. And so Jesus says, you say. Brilliantly, powerfully, marvelously ambiguous. And the fact that Jesus won't fit into one of Pilate's categories is part of why Pilate's response is one of apathy. And there's a little Pilate in me. When Jesus doesn't fit into my nice categories, I begin to miss the connection with my life. I begin to think it doesn't matter so much. Because if he fit in one of these categories, I could then define how it was supposed to affect me. All right, Q&A number 1 is really important. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, yes and no. Now, question number 2. Did that pique your interest a little bit? All right, let's watch. So we have to go to another gospel to see the follow-up dialogue for this. Remember, I told you that all of the writers have a little bit different perspective. So when Jesus is not responding to the accusations that I just read about from the religious leaders, really interesting that the religious leaders and the political leaders had different reactions to Jesus. When Jesus doesn't respond, Pilate asks him another question, and John records it for us. In John chapter 19, verses 10 and 11, we see question number 2 and answer number 2 from Jesus. Verse 10, do you refuse to speak to me, Pilate said. Here comes the question. Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Here comes the answer. Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given you from above. Q2 is, hey, buddy, don't you understand? Don't you realize the kind of power that I have? Now, that's just such a marvelously interesting question. Jesus apparently has already been roughed up a little bit at this point. He's in shackles, and the person who's responsible for detaining him asks, do you realize the power that I have? You're thinking, I'm a walking example of the power that you have. Of course, how could he not realize the power that he had? And so let's ask ourselves the question, what kind of power did Pilate have? The normal political kind. That's the answer, what it would be, right? That he had political power. And what is political power? Demonstrated by do everything that you can to get your way. Isn't that what politicians still do today? Yeah, absolutely. That's what Pilate was doing then. Political power is power of force. You're in control. It's of self-assertion. Political power is self-promotion. Defend yourself at all costs. Show no weakness. Nothing has changed, right? That's the kind of power that Pilate has. And he says to Jesus, don't you realize my power? Now, notice here that Pilate is not the least bit threatened by Jesus, right? The religious leaders apparently are very threatened by Jesus and what they assume that he has come to do. Pilate is not. To him, it's sort of a joke. He mocks Jesus and his so-called authority. He's not threatened by him at all. He's no threat because he has no real power. Because Pilate says, don't you realize I have all the power here? Pilate is not acting then when he just says, I don't think there's anything necessarily all that wrong with this guy. He's not acting out of some heart of justice. Don't misconstrue it. He's acting out of apathy. He's saying, what difference does it make? The guy's a non-story. Whether he lives or dies is of no concern to me and probably shouldn't be any concern to you. It just doesn't matter. Now, that's one of the most dangerous responses to Jesus that you could ever have. Now, that's question number 2. Don't you realize that I have the power? And the answer is Jesus says, oh, I realize. I realize what power you have because I gave it to you. And you wouldn't have any if I didn't decide to give it to you. How bold is that? Yeah, the one, I hope you're getting a different picture of Jesus. Leading up to Easter, Jesus sits with the person who has the ability to free him and says, do I realize? Oh yeah, I realize. You don't realize where your power came from. Because if I didn't want you to have power right now, you wouldn't have any power, bud. Wow. See, Jesus had power that was nothing like they had ever seen before. Jesus had power that was opposite of Pilate's. Pilate's power was self-promoting. Jesus was self-emptying, right? Pilate's power was defend yourself and show no weakness. Jesus' power was make yourself vulnerable. Make sure you see this contrast. I want you to see this contrast. When they beat him, they said, use your power to stop us. And Jesus says, I'm using my power not to stop you. Do you see it? They blindfolded him and they smacked him and they said, use your power to tell us who's doing that. And he's saying, I am using my power to not tell you. I can see perfectly. You can't see at all this power that I'm demonstrating. They say, if you had power, you would stop us. And Jesus says, it's because I have power that I'm not stopping you. Fast forward to the cross. Look at the cross. What do they say about him, the Romans? They mock him. And they say, look, he can save others, but he can't save himself. And the truth is, he can save others exactly because he won't save himself. Do you see it? The truth is, if he would have saved himself, he couldn't save us. And if he wants to save us, he can't save himself. And that, my friends, is power. That is power. When you voluntarily make yourself weak, when you're already strong, and you have another option, that's power. And that power actually changes things and people and systems. And it did. The kind of power that Pilate had, the kind of power that we're used to, what does it actually ever change? Not much. Not much. Just look at what, anybody here know anything Pilate ever changed? No. Anybody here know the things that Jesus changed? Oh my word. Do you realize, question number 2, do you realize the kind of power that I have? Jesus answered, I realize. You don't realize the kind of power that you have and the kind of power that I have. So Jesus and Pilate are exact opposites. One claims to have power, Pilate, but ends up giving in to pressure from a bunch of religious people because he doesn't care, because he's apathetic. And the other, who's seen as weak, Jesus, never gives in because he cares so much. All right, question 1, are you the king of the Jews? Yes and no. Question number 2, Do you realize what kind of power I have? Answer number 2. Oh, I realize what kind of power you have. Question number 3. Got to go back to Matthew chapter 27. Because the next question, the last question for this morning, is not asked of Jesus. It is asked of a crowd that's gathered. Let me pick up the story where we left off in verse 15. Now, it was the governor's custom, remember the governor is Pilate, at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So, when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. When Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." It's the biblical teaching to listen to your wife. Can I get an amen from the ladies in the room? Okay. But, verse 20. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." Why? What crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him, crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I'm innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It's your responsibility." All the people answered, "His blood is on our children, on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Question number 3 is this: which one do you want me to release? And in it, don't you see Pilate's apathy? Even at this point, he's thinking that maybe this can turn out okay without me having to do anything. Maybe I can get out of this mess without having to risk anything or without having to cost anything to me. And as it would turn out, he's got 2 Jesuses. Did you notice that in the scripture? You ever see that before? That it was Jesus number 1 and Jesus number 2. And so to Pilate, he's like, it doesn't matter to me. It seems like Jesus number 2 doesn't really deserve much of anything. And Jesus number 1 is pretty sure he killed a guy in trying to overthrow the Roman government. So which one do you want me to release to you? There are 2 Jesuses. Now, some commentators have noted that the name Barabbas is a combination. Bar means son of, and Abba means father. Jesus, son of the Father. Number 1 and number 2. Pilate, doesn't make any difference. Which one do you want? Now imagine just for a second. Imagine being Barabbas. And you are locked up for killing someone in trying to rebel against the occupying force. And you know what that means. And so you're in your cell, and you know that the days must be getting short, that they're going to pass judgment on you, what your future is going to be. And you hear the crowd outside. And the first thing you hear, you can't hear the dialogue, but you just hear the crowd, and they start yelling your name. "Barabbas! Barabbas!" You think, oh, let's see how this goes. And then the next thing you hear is, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" See, he can't hear the back and forth. You think, oh boy, here it goes. I knew this day would come. And the jailer comes down, opens up the door, and you're ready. And then he just takes the shackles off and says, "You're free to go." Excuse me? You're free to go. What? Yeah. Jesus, number 2, is taking your spot. Jesus, number 2, is carrying the cross that we had built for you. What? This makes no sense to me. I don't even know the man. How can this possibly be true? His life has nothing to do with mine. See, the truth is that Barabbas was being set free the way Jesus ought to, and Jesus was being accused of the thing that Barabbas was actually guilty of. And if you could talk to him, you would want to say, Barabbas, you fool. His life has everything to do with yours. His life is the reason that you even have a life. And the same is true of you. The same is true of me. that Jesus has everything to do with my life and with yours. And his life had everything to do with Pilate's. But Pilate didn't see it. Didn't think it mattered. And there's a little Pilate in all of us. And apathy is the most inappropriate response to the person and the work of Christ. Crown him or kill him, but don't just tolerate him. And so, maybe you want to take out this sticker that we gave you on the way in. Yeah, like, actually take it out now. And as we end this service this morning, maybe you'll look at that name for more than a second or two. Because when I start to look at it, I start to see myself. I start to see someone who has a lot of the same characteristics as Pilate does. Is there any apathy in your life when it comes to following Jesus, where you think it just doesn't seem to matter? It's a little Pilate in me. And so I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up at this point, and we're going to close with a song. And during it, we're going to give you the opportunity to come back up to the cross. But before we do that, as they're coming up, I want to give you a real-life picture. I want to share with you another story of someone who thought, this doesn't really change anything. And the turning point for her when she figured out that it actually changed everything. Here's Dacia's story.
Hi, my name is Dacia. I've been attending Crossroads for a little over 3 years now. But in using Reed's words, I was never plugged in. Prior to this past December, I've always believed in God, but I didn't know him or have a relationship with him. I enjoyed attending the services here at Crossroads, but when I left the service, I went right back to my life as I knew it. I didn't think about the message of that day, and I didn't think about Jesus. I found in my relationships with friends and even my husband, I never allowed myself to truly be loved. I kept everyone at arm's length. Then one day I received a phone call from Elise Resch. Elise saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, or maybe I didn't want to see it. It was my brokenness. She invited me to join a small group of women she was going to be leading. I decided to join the group just because I enjoyed being around Elise. I remember before walking into that first meeting, sitting in my car and telling myself, I'm not going to share anything. I'm definitely not going to like any of these other women. And certainly, this will not change my life. After several weeks, everyone started to open up and share their feelings and their past experiences. I found myself becoming overwhelmed and scared. I left the group for 3 weeks. Elise reached out to me every week, asking if I was coming back. She listened to all my excuses and then just simply said, "Can I pray for you?" That moment changed everything for me. I felt as if God was handing me a gift, and all I had to do was unwrap it. That night I made a promise to God and to myself that I was going to accept Christ into my heart, and I was never going to doubt him. I sent Elise a text letting her know I was coming back and I was in 100%. I then made the decision to be baptized this past January here at Crossroads. Since making the decision to come back to the group and accept Christ into my life, everything has changed. As for all of those women in my group who I swore I would never like, I am proud to say they are my soul sisters for life now. The message I hope you take with you is that you are never alone. God has already placed his gift in front of you. All you have to do is unwrap his gift. I promise you, it will change your life forever, and you will never regret it.